He grew up in a world without sound, but that never stopped him from making himself heard. Always underestimated, he found his strongest voice in writing. And when an unexpected challenge arose at school, he proved that true power lies not in what you hear, but in what you understand. Since he was a child, Alexander Mendoza knew he was different. Not because he wanted to be, but because life had made him that way. At 5 years old, he completely lost his hearing due to a severe infection that the doctors in the small town of San Miguel de Allende couldn't control in time. His parents, Sofia and Raymond, humble artisans from the Guanajuato region, faced enormous difficulties helping their son adapt to a world where everyone communicated in a way he could no longer understand. Little Alexander watched nostalgically as the other children played, shouted and laughed in the central plaza. He vaguely remembered some sounds, the mariachi band that played on Sundays, his mother's sweet voice singing him to sleep, the ringing of the parish bells. Now, everything was silence. A silence that weighed on his shoulders like an invisible blanket, separating him from the rest of the world. The Benito Juarez Elementary School, which should have been a haven of learning, became his daily battlefield. The children whispered, laughed, and often talked about him in his presence as if he were invisible. Alexander saw the looks, the hidden laughter, and the mocking gestures. But what hurt him the most was the indifference. Most simply ignored him, as if his presence were irrelevant. Mrs. Guadalupe Fuentes, the teacher, though well-meaning, seemed unsure how to truly include him. She gave him simpler tasks, smiled condescendingly, and never expected him to keep up with the class. Poor little boy, he had seen her murmur several times while looking at him with pity. Why does he even come to school? He once lip-read a classmate saying, he can't even understand what the teacher is explaining. Every day was a test. Every glance a reminder of his difference. Every compassionate smile another wound in his young heart. But Alexander possessed something others didn't see. A fierce determination that grew with every obstacle. At home, he studied for hours, read books his father borrowed from the municipal library, and practiced his writing to express himself better. He developed a deep love for words, as they were his bridge to the world. He couldn't speak, but he could write. He couldn't hear, but he could understand. As he grew, so did his frustration. By 12, Alexander had mastered lip reading and significantly improved his writing. But he was still the deaf boy to the entire community. No one expected anything extraordinary from him. Everything changed when the Mendoza family met Carmen Ortega, a retired teacher who had just moved to San Miguel de Allende. Carmen had worked with hearing-impaired children in Mexico City and, upon learning about Alexander's situation, offered to teach him Mexican Sign Language. "Your son doesn't need pity," Carmen told Sofia. "He needs tools to communicate with the world." Carmen not only taught him to communicate with his hands, but also showed him that his condition wasn't a sentence of eternal isolation. She told him about famous deaf individuals, artists, writers, and inventors who had changed the world, despite their limitations. "Don't let others define who you are, Alexander," she told him one day, making sure he could clearly read her lips. "You decide who you want to be." And Alexander decided. He decided he wouldn't be the victim, the object of pity, the invisible boy. He decided he would be more, much more than anyone expected. At 15, when he entered Ignacio Allende High School, Alexander was no longer the shy, withdrawn child. Though he still faced curious looks and occasional mockery, he now walked with his head held high. His notebook was always filled with ideas, poems, and reflections no one else could read. It was in high school that he met Isabella Rodriguez, the daughter of San Miguel de Allende's mayor. Isabella was everything he wasn't: popular, outgoing, always surrounded by friends, but they shared something essential: a love for literature. One day during Spanish class, Mr. Hector Vasquez proposed an activity. Each student would answer a question on the board about the last book they had read. Pedro Páramo by Juan Rulfo. Most wrote short, banal answers as usual. When it was Alexander's turn, giggles spread through the classroom. "Why bother? He doesn't even understand what's going on," whispered Edward James, the most popular boy in class, loud enough for Alexander to read his lips. Isabella, sitting in the front row, frowned at the comment. She had never spoken to Alexander, but something about the determination in his gaze had always caught her attention. Ignoring the murmurs, Alexander stood up, took the chalk, and began to write. With each word he wrote on the board, silence spread through the classroom. The laughter disappeared, the stares fixed on the board, mouths agape. Even Mr. Vasquez covered his mouth in surprise. What Alexander wrote wasn't just an answer. It was a profound and moving analysis of the silence in Pedro Paramo, how silence could be more eloquent than any word, how the murmurs of Comala reflected the whispers he had felt around him all his life. He compared his personal experience to the loneliness of Rulfo's characters, creating a parallelism that left everyone speechless. When he finished, he turned and saw tears in the teacher's eyes. The classmates, once so confident, now avoided his gaze. The silence left in the classroom wasn't just from a lack of words, it was the weight of shame, of reflection. Isabella looked at him with a mix of admiration and curiosity. For the first time, she saw beyond his silence. She saw a young man with a brilliant mind and a brave heart, and she decided she wanted to know him better. That day marked the beginning of a change in Alexander's life. What he didn't know was that it would also be the start of a story that would forever change not only his life, but also the entire community of San Miguel de Allende. Isabella Rodriguez had never been like the other girls. Despite being the daughter of Mayor Javier Rodriguez, one of the most influential men in San Miguel de Allende, she had always rejected the privileges and superficiality her social position offered. She preferred spending hours in the municipal library to attending exclusive parties in the historic center. However, her position made her the center of attention, especially for boys like Edward James, whose family of hotel entrepreneurs saw her as an opportunity for social advancement. After the incident in literature class, Isabella began to see Alexander in a new light. She saw him in the library, always alone, immersed in worlds of paper and ink. She saw him in the courtyard during recess, sketching in his notebook. She saw him, and each time she wondered more about his world, a world without sounds but full of words. One Tuesday afternoon, while Alexander was studying in the library, Isabella approached his table. She left a note on the book he was reading. "I'd like to learn to talk with you. Will you teach me some signs?" Alexander looked up, surprised. No one, apart from his family and Carmen, had shown interest in learning his language. With some initial hesitation, he nodded slightly. Thus began their meetings in the library. Isabella was a quick and enthusiastic learner. With each new sign, she learned. She felt a door opening to a different world, a world where words took shape in the air and feelings were expressed with the whole body. "It's fascinating," she commented one day, alternating between clumsy signs and slow-spoken words so he could read her lips. "It's like every word is a little dance." Alexander smiled at her enthusiasm. For the first time since losing his hearing, he felt someone truly trying to enter his world, rather than forcing him to adapt completely to theirs. As the weeks passed, the friendship between Isabella and Alexander grew, sparking whispers in the high school hallways. Edward James, who had always seen Isabella as his future girlfriend, didn't take kindly to this new friendship. Why waste? "Your time with the deaf-mute?" he asked her one day, making sure Alexander could see him. "There are so many interesting people at this school, and you choose the weird one." Isabella faced him with a cold stare. "The only limited one here is you, Edward. Alexander has more to say than all of you combined." The tension between the three grew. Edward began organizing more direct mockery of Alexander, mimicking his gestures when he tried to communicate or hiding his books. Isabella became his defender, which only increased the hostility from Edward and his group. Meanwhile, at home, Sophia and Raymond watched with a mix of joy and concern their son's growing friendship with the mayor's daughter. On one hand, they were happy Alexander finally had someone his age who understood him. On the other, they feared the complications this relationship with such an influential family could bring. "Mayor Rodriguez won't be happy when he finds out," Raymond commented one night. "You know how those families are, Sophia. They have plans for their children, and those plans don't include boys like our Alexander. Sophia, however, had more faith. She had seen how her son had blossomed in recent months, how he smiled again, how his eyes sparkled when he talked about Isabella. She couldn't let fear of what others might say extinguish that light. Our son deserves to be happy, Raymond, and if that girl makes him happy, we should support him. What neither of them knew was that Carmen Ortega, the retired teacher who had been so important in Alexander's life, had an unexpected connection to the Rodriguez family. Years ago, she had been the private tutor of Isabella's mother, Gabriela Montero, now the mayor's wife. This link would be crucial in the events about to unfold. One day, Carmen invited Alexander and Isabella to her home, a small but cozy apartment near the main garden. She showed them old photographs, including some of a young Gabriela. "You know my mother?" Isabella asked, astonished. Carmen nodded with a nostalgic smile. "I was her literature teacher for 5 years. She was brilliant, sensitive, very much like you. She dreamed of being a writer." "She never told me that," Isabella murmured, confused. "She's always been, though, the perfect mayor's wife. She never mentioned wanting to write." Carmen sighed deeply. "Sometimes life takes us down paths we didn't plan. Your grandfather, Don Francisco Montero, was a very traditional man. He didn't approve of his daughter having literary aspirations. And when she met your father, she saw it as an opportunity," Isabella completed, beginning to see her mother in a new light. Carmen nodded again and looked at Alexander, who had been following the conversation attentively. "That's why I wanted to bring you two together today. You remind me so much of Gabriela at your age. That passion for words, that sensitivity. Don't let anyone tell you who you should be or who you should share your life with." That afternoon, as they walked through the cobblestone streets of San Miguel, Isabella and Alexander reflected on Carmen's words. The revelation about her mother had shaken Isabella. Suddenly, many things made sense. Her mother's extensive personal library, her moments of melancholy as she gazed out the window at the mountains, her quiet but constant support for the city's cultural projects. Sitting on a bench in the main plaza, with the setting sun casting a golden glow on the San Miguel Arcangel parish, Isabella took Alexander's hands and, using the signs she had worked so hard to learn, confessed her feelings. "I fell in love with the way you see the world, how you shape your thoughts with your hands, your bravery," she said, her fingers moving with determination. "I don't care what others say. I don't care about Edward or my father or anyone." Alexander, his heart pounding, responded with his own signs. "I'm afraid of what might happen. Your world and mine are very different." "No, they're not," Isabella insisted. "We are more alike than you think. We both live in worlds where no one really listens to us, where they expect us to follow scripts written by others." At that moment, as if fate wanted to confirm her words, they saw Edward James walking toward them with a group of friends. His expression made it clear he wasn't coming with good intentions. "Well, well, the princess and the beggar," Edward exclaimed, provoking laughter from his friends. "Don't you get tired of doing charity work, Isabella?" Alexander tensed, but Isabella squeezed his hand. "Ignore him," she said, making sure he could read her lips. "He's not worth it." But Edward wasn't willing to be ignored. He stepped closer, intentionally blocking Alexander's view so he couldn't follow what he was saying. "You know she's only with you out of pity, right?" Edward said to Alexander, turning his back to Isabella so he couldn't read his lips. "We all know it's part of her social service project. Help a disabled person and feel good about yourself." Isabella tried to intervene, but Edward gently pushed her aside. "Just having an honest chat with your friend," he said with false innocence. What Edward didn't know was that Alexander, after years of isolation, had developed an extraordinary ability to read body language. He didn't need to hear the words to feel their venom. With a calm that surprised everyone, he took out his notebook and wrote something. Then he handed it to Edward. The boy's face changed from mockery to surprise, then to contained anger. As he read, without another word, he walked away with his friends. "What did you write to him?" Isabella asked, curious and worried, as she watched Edward and his friends leave. Alexander smiled slightly and took his notebook. He wrote, "I told him I know what he thinks of me, but his opinion is irrelevant. I told him you see something. In me he'll never see because he's too busy looking at himself. And finally I reminded him that we all have limitations, but his is the saddest. He can't see beyond appearances." Isabella read it and felt her heart swell with admiration and affection. Without thinking twice, she leaned in and gently kissed Alexander's cheek. It was a simple gesture, but loaded with meaning, and it didn't go unnoticed by the passers-by in the plaza. What neither of them knew was that among those passers-by was Maria, Mayor Rodriguez's personal assistant, who immediately took out her phone to inform her boss. The next day, Isabella was called to her father's office in their colonial residence in the historic center. Mayor Javier Rodriguez was an imposing man, known for his strong character and political ambitions. At 50, he had transformed San Miguel de Allende into an internationally renowned tourist destination, attracting millions in investments and raising the city's profile. "Is it true what I've been told about your friendship with the Mendoza's son?" he asked bluntly. Isabella lifted her chin defiantly. "If you're referring to my relationship with Alexander, yes, it's true. He's my friend and I care about him deeply." "Friend?" Javier let out a dry laugh. "Maria saw you kissing him in the plaza." "It was a kiss on the cheek, Dad, and even if it had been more, I don't see why it should matter so much to you." Javier stood up, walking to the window overlooking the main plaza. From there, he could see the majestic facade of the parish, a symbol of the power and tradition he valued so much. "You're the mayor's daughter, Isabella. Everything you do matters. Appearances matter. And honestly, I don't think that boy is suitable for you." "Suitable?" Isabella's voice trembled with indignation. "Because he can't hear? Or because his family doesn't have the right last name or enough money?" "It's not just that." Javier turned to look at her. "It's about your future. You're 17, about to start college. Have you thought about how difficult it would be to build a life with someone like him?" "Someone like him," Isabella repeated bitterly. "Someone brilliant, sensitive, brave, someone who has overcome more obstacles than you or I ever will. That's someone." The tension between father and daughter was interrupted by the entrance of Gabriela, who had overheard part of the conversation from the hallway. Gabriela Montero de Rodriguez, with her discreet elegance and eternal expression of serenity, rarely intervened in family conflicts. But this time something had changed in her gaze. "Javier, I need to speak with Isabella alone," she said, with unusual firmness. Surprised by his wife's intervention, the mayor nodded and left the office, not without giving his daughter a warning. "Look." Once alone, Gabriela sat beside Isabella and took her hands. "Carmen called me last night," she said softly. "She told me about your friendship with Alexander Mendoza." Isabella tensed. "Are you going to tell me he's not suitable for—" "Me too." Gabriela smiled melancholically. "No, dear. I'm going to tell you a story I've never told you. A story about a young woman who, like you, fell in love with someone her family considered unsuitable." In a calm voice, Gabriela recounted how at 20, while studying literature at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, she had fallen deeply in love with a young poet whose family came from Oaxaca and lived modestly in the capital. Her father, Don Francisco, had discovered the relationship and used all his influence to separate them, even threatening to withdraw financial support if she continued seeing him. "What happened to him?" Isabella asked, moved by the revelation. "The last I heard, he published a book of poetry and moved to Europe," Gabriela sighed. "And I returned to San Miguel, met your father at a society party, and the rest you know." "Did you love him, Dad, when you married him?" "Your father was attractive, ambitious, confident. Over time I learned to love him in my own way. But I never forgot what I felt for Esteban, the poet. I never forgot the passion for writing we shared." Gabriela walked to an old mahogany desk in the corner of the office. From one of the drawers, she pulled out a worn leather notebook. "I've been writing poetry all my life, in secret. It's My way of keeping alive a part of me I thought was lost. Isabella took the notebook with reverence, understanding her mother completely for the first time. She wasn't just the mayor's perfect wife. She was a woman with her own dreams, a rich and complex inner life she had had to hide. "Don't make my mistakes, Isabella," Gabriella said intensely. "Don't let others decide who you should be or who you should love." That same day, while Javier Rodriguez met with important investors to discuss a new tourism development, Gabriella did something that surprised everyone. She personally visited the Mendoza's modest craft workshop in the San Antonio neighborhood. Sophia and Raymond received her with visible nervousness. The mayor's wife had never set foot in their small business, where they created and sold traditional ceramic pieces. Gabriella, however, approached them with a calm and determined demeanor, her presence both regal and approachable. "I've come to talk about our children," Gabriella said without preamble, "and about how we can support them instead of standing in the way of their happiness." The conversation that followed was long and emotional. Gabriella shared her own story, her regrets, and her desire for her daughter to have the freedom she had never been allowed. Sophia, with tears in her eyes, spoke of her fears for Alexander's future, the pain of seeing him isolated for so many years, and the joy Isabella had brought into his life. "My husband won't accept this easily," Gabriella warned. "Javier has big plans for Isabella. He wants her to study law or economics abroad to follow in his footsteps in politics. And our Alexander wants to be a writer," Raymond added with a mix of pride and concern. "He's won some local poetry contests. Carmen says he has extraordinary talent." Gabriella smiled at this. "Carmen is never wrong about these things. She was the one who first saw my potential as a writer." As the three adults talked, searching for ways to support their children, something extraordinary was happening at Ignacio Allende High School. Mr. Hector Vasquez had organized an essay contest on the importance of inclusion. Though he hadn't explicitly said so, everyone knew the initiative had been inspired by Alexander's moving analysis of Pedro Páramo. Edward James, still humiliated by his encounter with Alexander in the plaza, decided to mock the contest publicly during recess. What he didn't expect was for his best friend, Michael Valdez, the captain of the soccer team, to confront him. "Enough, Edward," Michael said firmly. "Aren't you tired of always being the villain of the story?" "What are you talking about?" Edward seemed genuinely surprised. "My younger sister was born with Down syndrome," Michael revealed, something he had never shared with his classmates. "Every day she fights against the prejudices of people like you, who look at her as if she's less of a person, because she's different." An uncomfortable silence fell over the group. Edward, for the first time, had no response. Isabella and Alexander, who had witnessed the scene from a distance, exchanged a look of astonishment. Something was changing at the school, and they, without intending to, had been the catalyst. That afternoon, while studying in the library, Isabella showed Alexander her mother's poetry notebook. He read it attentively, nodding with admiration at the depth and beauty of the verses. "Your mother has a lot of talent," he signed. "Why didn't she ever publish?" "Fear," Isabella replied. "Fear of what my grandfather would say, fear of not fitting into the role expected of her, fear of being judged." Alexander thought for a moment and then wrote, "Fear paralyzes all of us in different ways. I'm afraid too. Afraid of not being enough for you, of you one day growing tired of having to work so hard to communicate with me." Isabella shook, her head emphatically. "Never," she said aloud while her hands formed the same word in signs. "Being with you isn't an effort, it's a privilege. You've taught me to truly listen, with my whole being, not just my ears." The librarian, watching discreetly from her desk, smiled to herself. It was clear that love was blossoming between these two extraordinary young people. As the weeks passed, the essay contest became the center of attention at the school. To everyone's surprise, Edward James decided to participate. His change in attitude had been gradual but noticeable. Conversations with Michael, combined with the shame he felt after his last encounter with Alexander, had led him to deep reflection. The day of the awards ceremony arrived. The high school auditorium was packed. Mr. Vasquez had invited important community figures, including Mayor Rodriguez and his wife. Carmen Ortega was also there, sitting quietly in the back. This contest was born out of a desire to foster empathy and respect for diversity, Mr. Vasquez explained. We received 32 essays, all remarkable for their sincerity and depth, but 3 stood out. When he announced third place, a murmur of astonishment spread through the auditorium. Edward James. The young man walked to the stage with a solemn expression, very different from his usual arrogance. "My essay is titled The Silence of My Prejudices," he said as he accepted his diploma. "I want to thank those who, without knowing it, taught me that true disability lies in those who can't see beyond appearances." His gaze briefly met Alexander's in a silent gesture of acknowledgement and apology. Second place went to Isabella with an essay titled Between Two Worlds, where she described her experience learning sign language and discovering a new way of communication beyond spoken words. When she took the stage, she signed part of her acceptance speech, earning enthusiastic applause from the audience. Finally, it was time to announce the first place winner. Mr. Vasquez paused for dramatic effect. "The winner has written the most moving and powerful essay I've read in my 20 years as an educator." Through his personal experience, he invites us to reflect on the true meanings of silence, communication, and human dignity. First place goes to Alexander Mendoza, Ford A. His essay, The Words I Never Heard. The auditorium erupted in applause. Sophia and Raymond, sitting in the third row, couldn't hold back their tears of pride. Carmen Ortega smiled with satisfaction from her seat. Alexander walked to the stage with steady steps. Mr. Vasquez handed him the award, a statuette, shaped like a stylized quill, and an envelope containing a full scholarship to study literature at the University of Guanajuato. Then he offered him the microphone. To everyone's surprise, especially those who didn't know him well, Alexander took the microphone and held it close to his lips. With a voice he rarely used, hesitant but clear, he spoke just 2 words. "Thank you." Everyone. The impact was immediate. A reverent silence fell over the auditorium, followed by a standing ovation. Isabella, from her place on the stage as the second place winner, looked at him with eyes shining with emotion and pride. In the satin au front row, Mayor Rodriguez watched the scene with an inscrutable expression. Beside him, Gabriela squeezed his hand tightly, her eyes pleading with him to see what she saw, the extraordinary courage and determination of this young man. After the ceremony, as students and their families enjoyed a small reception in the school courtyard, Javier Rodriguez approached Alexander and Isabella, who were animatedly talking with Carmen. "Congratulations on your award, young man," he said formally, extending his hand to Alexander. The young man shook it firmly, holding the mayor's gaze without hesitation. "I'd like to invite you and your parents to dinner at our house this weekend," Javier continued, making sure to speak clearly so Alexander could read his lips. "I think we have much to discuss." Isabella, barely containing her excitement, translated her father's words into sign language to ensure Alexander fully understood. The grateful smile her father gave her took her by surprise. "Have you been learning sign language?" she asked, astonished. "Just a little," Javier admitted. "Your mother has been teaching me some basic phrases." That small gesture meant more than any words could express. It was the first step toward acceptance, toward a future where differences weren't barriers, but bridges. 3 months later, at the high school graduation, Alexander was chosen to give a special speech. Instead of speaking, he projected a video where, using sign language, he shared his experiences and thanked those who had supported him on his journey. Isabella, standing beside him, translated his signs for the audience. "Silence can be a prison or a blank canvas," Alexander expressed. "It's up to us to turn it into a work of art. Years ago, I believed my world would always be limited. Today, I know there are no limits for those who dare to dream, to create, to love." In the audience, Edward James applauded with sincere respect. His transformation had perhaps been the most surprising change in this entire story. From being the school's most notorious bully, he had become an advocate for inclusion, even founding a sign language club. Gabriela Rodriguez, sitting beside her husband, held an envelope that would change her life, the acceptance of a poetry collection she had secretly submitted to a publisher. At 45, she was about to fulfill the dream she had postponed for decades. The ceremony ended with an announcement from Mayor Rodriguez. The city would launch an ambitious inclusion program for people with disabilities, inspired by Alexander's story. The first project would be a library with a special section for Braille literature and resources for the deaf, named after Carmen Ortega, in recognition of her tireless work. At sunset, as the sun bathed the colonial domes and facades of San Miguel de Allende in gold, Alexander and Isabella found themselves in their favorite spot, the rooftop of the Mendoza's workshop, which offered a panoramic view of the city. Hand in hand, they gazed at the horizon, thinking about the future ahead. Isabella had decided to study linguistics, specializing in sign language, while Alexander would begin his literature degree at the University of Guanajuato. It wouldn't be easy, they both knew, but they had proven that the hardest obstacles could be overcome with determination and mutual support. "You know what's most ironic?" Alexander sighed. "I lost the ability to hear, but because of that I learned to truly listen. And you, who can hear perfectly, learned to communicate without spoken words." Isabella smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "Maybe that's the most important message of our story," she said aloud while her hands formed the corresponding signs. "That true communication doesn't depend on the senses we have, but on the willingness to connect with others." The sun finally disappeared behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of purple and orange. In that perfect moment, under the starry sky of Guanajuato, Alexander and Isabella sealed their promise of a shared future with a kiss that needed no words to express everything they felt.